Hey, greetings, aviators and aviation fans. This is Mike, the Chili Dog pilot. Hope you guys are all doing well. It's an overcast day. It's actually July 5th, if you're keeping track, although this probably won't come out until mid to late July. But anyways, wanted to take today's time to basically do another in our series on aircraft ownership costs. And today I want to talk about probably one of the largest costs that any airplane owner could potentially face in the time that they own the airplane, or even if they're just purchasing a new one, and that is the engine overhaul cost. So what I would like to do in today's series is talk about a couple parts. One, why do we do engine overhauls? Secondly, what are the general approaches that one can take if they're having to do an engine overhaul? I will share a little bit of my experience when I did the overhaul for the Tomahawk here, and I'll close with some additional thoughts. So with that, why do we do engine overhauls? So engine overhauls aren't specific to just aviation and just airplanes. You will see overhaul recommendations by manufacturers across a lot of areas to include any types of machinery that are used in operation. And what that does is it really provides two things for an owner. One, it's to ensure that the machinery continues to work as expected. And two, it kind of gives you an expectation of what the maintenance outlays and schedule is for that machinery. So specific to airplanes, why do we do it? Obviously, when you think about airplane engines versus car engines, the majority of the time, these piston engines are direct drive, and they're probably operating at full power or pretty close to full power. I would say probably 90 to 95% of the time. So there is a lot of wear and tear. And then the other factor to consider is it is an airplane, right? So from a redundancy and safety standpoint, you want to ensure that the engine is going to remain in an operational standpoint, and you want to minimize any type of engine failure that could occur because of improper maintenance or just wear and tear on the airplanes. So that's probably the main reason why we do that. Now, the other thing to consider for airplane owners is what the TBOs are, and those are going to so that time between overhaul is a time that's going to be dictated by the engine manufacturer. So Lycoming, Continental, will give you times for every particular engine type, and not all engine types have the same TBO. For example, in the Tomahawk here, the TBO time for the O235 that powers it is 2,400 hours. So what they're saying, what Lycoming is saying in that situation is, under normal operating procedures, this engine should be able to go 2,400 hours before it needs to have an overhaul done. When I look at some of the other airplanes I fly, so if I look at the three airplanes in the club, that's the Piper Archer, the Piper Dakota, and the Piper Lance, I think all of those have a 2,000 hour overhaul time. And then what I find to have lower times generally are those engines that are turbocharged. That's a little bit more wear and tear on the engine as well as the turbocharge element. So I think typically I see a lot of those engines being probably about 1,800 hours for overhaul. But generally, you could plan on 2,000 hours as kind of the norm. Now, as an airplane owner, two other things to consider is what type of operation you're doing. So if you're a private owner and you're flying for pleasure and just using the aircraft for your own utilization, the overhaul is really just a strong suggestion from the engine manufacturer. And so as an aircraft owner, you could go well beyond that TBO, and there's no regulations that's preventing you from doing that. If you're operating your airplane in any type of commercial setting, so primarily for owners like myself, if I were to be leasing back this airplane or renting it out for flight instruction or what have you, then much like what we talked about when we were talking about just regular maintenance, the FAA is going to want you to adhere to those TBO times that are recommended by the manufacturer. So if I was renting this airplane out, for example, or leasing it back to a place that's renting airplanes and putting it in their fleet, this airplane would be bound by that 2,400 hour TBO. So let's talk a little bit about TBOs from a bigger picture. So I am a big fan of Mike Bush. I've read all his books. I occasionally watch his YouTube channels. And so he has a philosophy that has been driven by a lot of his research and what his own experiences as an AMP. And some of this is also what's derived by some of the bigger operators and the military. So through a lot of this research that Mike has been looking at and sharing, is a lot of the times if the engines are operating well, the downtime that you have for an engine overhaul and the expense you have for an engine overhaul might be very preemptive in when it's being needed versus doing it in advance. So what he will talk about in his books, and what I think a lot of people do subscribe to in today's environment, is really waiting to overhaul the engine until the conditions require it. So what that means is if the engine's operating fine, the TBO is really just a suggestion, and it's not mandated, and by all means, if it's operating fine, keep operating it until it starts showing some sort of conditions that require you to consider an overhaul. Now, those who've been in aviation a while or fly a lot know one thing's for certain, right? The more that you operate your aircraft, the better it functions over time. So an airplane that is at a flight school, that's being rented out, that's in commercial operations and flies on a regular basis, meaning daily, if not every other day, or multiple times a week, tends to fare better than a plane that sits around and maybe flies once a month or less, or even 1 or 2 times a month or less. Now, specific to engines, why is that? Well, part of the reason is one of the things that helps our engines is good lubrication, and that lubrication is obviously spread throughout the engines and all the wear and tear parts while the engine's operating. When the engine's sitting on the ground, after a couple days, all that oil and all that additional lubrication that was protecting the engines and those wear parts has probably drained and settled to the bottom of the oil pan or oil reserve, and therefore you're basically subjecting your engine to early starts of corrosion and just the elements in and around it. With engines and airplanes that operate frequently, you have less of that because, again, it's getting a fresh quota of oil every multiple times a day, or at least every day, and so that helps. So what most what most mechanics are going to recommend, is to try to fly your plane as often as possible to avoid some of these this kind of non-operational wear and tear or corrosion on your airplanes. So I'll tell you a quick story, and where that comes into play is, one of my bad habits is I like to look at Trade-A-Plane and some of the other websites to see what airplanes are available and out there for sale. As I mentioned, I have this Tomahawk, and I also belong to a club, but at some point there is a point where I do want to purchase my own airplane that I can use for more of my travel. Again, the mission for this Tomahawk is really my daily flyer and just to practice flying, but it's not really the aircraft I use to travel anywhere. But as I was looking, I did find an airplane, so I have a list of probably about 4 or 5 different airframes that I'm interested in someday acquiring. And I found one on one of the web listings that was well under the market value for similar airframe hours, model year, and type aircraft. And so I started digging a little bit more into it. I was able to download the maintenance logs off the website. And one of the things I noticed that was kind of a red flag for me was that the airplane hasn't been flying much over the last 5 or 6 years. I think in total, it might have been like 200, 250 hours over the last 5 or 6 years. So you're talking, roughly 30 hours a year. And even, and so what I had done, just to get a second opinion on this, is Savvy Aviation, which is a company that Mike Bush operates, does offer logbook analysis and pre-buy help for its customers, and I think they might even offer it to people who are thinking about purchasing. But anyway, part of that is you get somebody else, another AMP, and someone who's very knowledgeable in this area, to also review the logbooks. And then we had a quick conversation about it, and just as I suspected, his big concern is the same as mine. Is for the lack of flying that this airplane had, is there's probably a pretty good chance that that engine, even though it's a low time engine, it probably has a lot of corrosion done to it. And so what he would recommend, if I was to move forward with trying to purchase this airplane, that the mechanic or the AMP who does the pre-purchase inspection really takes a strong look in the engine with borescopes and other methods to ensure that there isn't excessive corrosion, but also to keep in mind that that a engine overhaul may be needed. And so the next step of that was obviously trying to understand what is an engine overhaul going to cost for that airplane, because while the purchase price is pretty low, that purchase price may not be that great when you factor in engine overhaul price. And without going into a lot of details, when I did call 1 or 2 of the overhaul shops that I called for this airplane, I was getting probably about $100,000 for an engine overhaul for that particular engine. So, you know, it was a higher horsepower engine that was also turbocharged, so I think that contributed to the cost. The long story short on that one is, unless that price goes down further, I don't think the current offering price is worthwhile considering what the potential cost would be for doing the overhaul. So that's why it's a consideration if why you need to pay attention to the engine situation, whether you're purchasing an airplane or you're operating your own. So we can probably talk more about that later. So with that, let's go ahead and talk a little bit about the overhaul process itself. So I think when you come to the time that your engine needs an overhaul, there's probably two options that an owner that you have available to you. And I've seen owners do both. So the first option is you can simply just remove your engine from the airplane and then purchase a new engine from the manufacturer. You probably get some sort of credit for your old engine, and that way you're putting in a brand new engine at the time of overhaul. Needless to say, this is the most expensive option, but depending on the type of flying you're doing or your concerns, it in theory gives you the best engine that you could put into the airplane. So if money is not an object, this is a route that some people will take. And then, there are some people who fly a lot for business, and so I think they want that reliability of, a new engine. So the other downside to doing a new engine purchase from the manufacturer sometimes is wait times. I've heard, especially like as we were in the COVID areas, those engine wait times for a new engine of a given type could be anywhere from 1 to 2 years. So that is one that probably requires a little more planning than the normal overhaul. And what you'll do is, order that engine in advance, and that way you could do a quick swap out when your plane hits that TBO time or that overhaul time. The more common thing what people do is they will go and just overhaul their current engine. And what they will do is they will find a shop that will do those overhauls. So there's some big shops out there that a lot of people will utilize. I did the same thing. These are companies that do nothing but engine overhauls. So they have a lot of practice and a lot of experience, and obviously there's some benefit to that as they're overhauling your engine. They kind of know what they're doing. It's not a one and done thing. I think there is an option where you can also do an overhaul with your local A&P. Your mileage may vary. I don't have a lot of experience with that, but I know there are some people who do that. Sometimes it's a cost benefit. It's also, the benefit of the A&P who's doing the overhaul might know your engine well and know particular things to look on it. So now, when it comes to overhauling with an overhaul shop or any type of overhaul, there are a couple considerations to have. The first one is the downtime of the airplane. So typically, you're going to have a month or two of downtime, if not more, that your engine is going to be removed from the airplane, sent to the overhaul shop, and then it's going to undergo the overhaul process. For me, it was close to 6 months that my engine was down. And that was kind of within the time frame of what I was expecting, based on the shop's volume and their experience. They told me at the time that I sent the engine in that their turnaround time was anywhere between 4 to 6 months. And obviously we were kind of at the top end of that. Another option that some owners will do, because they don't want to have that long downtime with their airplane, is they will do like basically an engine swap situation. So they put the money down, and what they're going to do is they're going to buy an already overhauled engine, and that's going to come to them that they're going to put on their airplane, and they're going to trade in their engine that needs overhaul to that shop, and that way they minimize their downtime. So the challenges with that is sometimes that can be a little more expensive because you're paying for that convenience. One of the requirements there obviously is the shop that you're working with needs to have one of those overhauled engines on hand. And then, the big mystery part, which, I think there's different opinions on there, is you do not know what is the total time on the engine that you're getting that's overhauled. So an overhauled engine is basically overhauled to new conditions and requirements, but you could be trading in a 2,000-hour engine for an engine that has 8,000 hours but has been overhauled. For some people, that trade-off may not be worth it for the limited downtime. And then the typical, I think, approach is what a lot of us do and what I did is basically, remove my engine from the airplane, send it into the shop, have them overhaul it, and then when it comes back, it is, in an overhauled condition, and then carry some sort of warranty with that. So, that's more or less the process. Now, there's a couple factors that an owner needs to think about when they are deciding to overhaul their engine. So, the first one is obviously the cost of the overhaul. So many times you're going to get quotes from you should get multiple quotes from numerous shops on what they charge for that particular engine, and understand what some additional costs may be, because the reality is the price that they give you is is kind of the overhaul, but other things will pop up, and so that may be some additional costs. So you definitely want to have, in my opinion, probably about a 10% wiggle room of some additional costs. In my case, I think, if I remember correctly, one of the additional costs that I had with mine was, I think the oil pan was either dented or in a way that they wanted to replace it, and I basically had the option of getting an overhauled oil pan or a new oil pan. I think I went with the overhauled. The price difference was pretty significant, and based on the conversation I had with the overhaul shop, that was the recommendation they made too. But that being said, they offer both because there are people who tend to prefer newer things. So let me talk about my process real quick, and at some point maybe I'll put up kind of the numbers for you. But once we made the determination when I was talking to my AMP about my engine at the time, it was starting to meet the conditions of where we wanted to go ahead and start thinking about overhauling it. And so what I did at that point in time is I basically had a good conversation with them about where are the shops that you have had experience with. Are there shops that you that you recommend people don't go to? And use that as my starting basis. So we had a nice conversation. There are a couple shops that had great reputations, but the recent experience was that they were just having more issues than not. So they say, if you could avoid it, do that. Consider some other places. I think in total I called about 5 or 6 different shops that did overhauls, and basically got from them a couple things. Wait time was probably the biggest one, because what I wanted to know is how quickly could they initiate the overhaul. In some cases, your popular shops could be a 1 to 2 year wait before they can even get to your airplane, and so that's something to consider. The second thing was obviously the overall price for the overhaul, and then kind of what they see as typical things that may also be additional costs. Warranty came into play. I think generally they're roughly the same. I think typically what you'll see for warranties on an overhaul is anywhere from 6 months to 2 years warranty if there's any issues with the engine in that period of time that's due to the overhaul, that they would fix it, and then a lot of times it's prorated after that. More likely than not, though, when it comes to an engine overhaul, if you're going to have any issues, it's probably going to be in that first 50 hours. And then the last thing I was asking for all of them is, 2 other things I was asking is how often do they particularly work on my type of engine, because every engine's different. Not that they're significantly different, but you want somebody who has worked on your engine type. For example, for a loose example, like I don't want to send my Lycoming to a place that primarily works on Continentals, and vice versa. So those are some of the things of consideration while I was working on, scoping out the overhaul price. And then, I did, as I was starting down this process, I didn't know about the ability to trade out engines. This, I believe, was going to be the second overhaul for this engine, so it's still a relatively low-time engine, and quite frankly, it's been operating quite well for me. So my preference was to keep it, but I did want to see, if anyone did have a finished overhauled engine on hand and what they would charge. So in my case, none of the shops had an 0235 for a Tomahawk available, so I was going with the longer route. So that's the first part of the calculus that goes into the cost of the overhaul. But keep in mind, there's other costs that go into it too. So I'll walk through what all my costs were. The other thing with the overhaul price is a good thing you want to find out about is the shipping of the engine factored into the price, or is that an additional cost? And I was like 50-50 on my experience. I'd say 3 of the shops, basically their price included shipping to and from the engine. And then for several of the others, they did not include shipping as part of it, but they did give me a quote on what shipping would be. So more than anything, it's just important to know, just because that way you can do a light comparison on price, because one could offer you an overhaul for $30,000, another one offer it for $2,750, but then you're paying $3,000 for shipping and handling each way, and so then the prices are more or less the same. So that was the major cost is obviously the overhaul. So that's the first thing you want to put on your your calculations for what this is going to cost you. The other thing you need to factor in is, and this is probably going to be a function of what you do with your local mechanic, and that is the removal of the engine, any preparation prior to installation, and then installation of the engine when it comes back. So I will be fully honest, like that is not a part that I had I had a quick conversation on price, but I probably should have been a little more detailed on how many hours and what that looks like from a price standpoint. Obviously, the removal of the engine was relatively inexpensive because it was just disconnecting it and pulling it out. Installation, obviously, much more involved. You want to make sure all the everything comes back in to the airplane in a good fashion, and you make sure all the connections work. And you also want them to do obviously a couple test runs before they turn it over to you for the break-in period. Other additional costs like that I did not like that a lot of people don't factor in is while your engine is off, what are you going to do with your propeller? In some cases, especially if you have a complex aircraft, that's a much bigger need of looking at doing a propeller and drive shaft, propeller shaft overhaul. I did the same thing with a fixed pitch, only because I was approaching 4,000 hours on this propeller, and I didn't really see any overhauls done on it. And so I also took the time of not having an engine, of taking my propeller down to one of the prop shops here to get it overhauled. And then the last thing, which some people do, and again it's a good conversation with your maintenance shop and your A&P, is the engine mount. Some folks will get their engine mounts overhauled every TBO. Some will do it every other. Again, since I was approaching almost 4,800 hours on this engine mount, and we had not seen any work done on it, I decided to go ahead and also send that away for overhaul. Also because it looked like there might have been a crack in one of the joints, and so we just wanted to make sure that that was up and running, because nothing would be worse than coming back with an overhauled fresh engine and then having the engine mount break at some point in your first few flights because of some old stress on there. Fortunately, the engine mount did not have any major issues with it, but it did get overhauled. So at the end of all this, all the things that I had done to the engine during the overhaul process was a TBO'd propeller, a new engine mount, and then obviously my A&P also did new baffles around the engine. And then you look at some of the some of the hoses and cables were also replaced. So so when you look at the engine overhaul, just factor in those additional costs, because those will be elements that will be important to you as you factor in the cost. So I would say off the top of my head, and I'll go through a spreadsheet here in a second here.
Okay, so now I'd like to take a few minutes just to kind of share with you my overall costs for the overhaul on my Lycoming 0235 engine. The biggest price, of course, is the overhaul itself, and that was almost $35,000. That being said, there were some additional costs to the original quote. 3 items needed to be replaced. One was the oil fill tube, the other was the oil release valve, and then the third was the oil pump. The next item that was a cost during the engine overhaul wasn't directly the engine, but it was the propeller. Since this propeller had gone a couple thousand hours, I figured it was worthwhile to send it into a propeller shop just to make sure it was overhauled and balanced, and that cost me about $1,200. Since the engine was off, I took that moment to send my engine mount in for welding repair, because again, we suspected a crack. And just so you know, on the Tomahawk, the engine mount is also the support system for the nose gear, so there is a lot of stress on that. Fortunately for me, there were no issues with the engine mount itself, so I just took the opportunity to have it stripped, cleaned, and painted white. And then finally, the last of the costs for the engine overhaul was the maintenance of both removing and reinstalling the engine. As you can see here, the reinstall did cost more money, and part of that was because some items were cleaned up, new baffles were made. But in total, the engine overhaul for the 0235 Lycoming was almost $45,000.
put that into perspective, for this airplane, that was all pretty much the cost of the airplane when you factor all those things in here. So as I say to you, this will be probably the largest expense that you could potentially run into as an aircraft owner. The only thing that could be more expensive is, depending on the airplane, is if you were to do an elaborate avionics upgrade.
And real quickly, here's just a few videos and snapshots of the process from engine removal to receiving the new engine and getting it back onto the airplane.
So needless to say, the engine overhaul can be one of the bigger expenses that you will face as an aircraft owner. Now, the nice thing is, when you look at this airplane, as I mentioned at the beginning here, the TBO for the 0235 in the Tomahawk is 2,400 hours. I typically fly this airplane between 100 to 140 hours a year. And so when you factor that into 2,400 hours, I'm talking probably at a minimum, I have 18 years, provided I fly the airplane regularly, keep up with maintenance, before I need to even worry about another engine overhaul. And then, given the price of an engine overhaul, if you are out in the market shopping for an airplane, definitely take into consideration the engine, not only the engine time, but the flight history of the airplane. You really want to dive in to understand the engine just as much as you want to understand the airplane. And then if it is suspected of needing an overhaul sooner than later, or has some red flags, you definitely want to factor in that overhaul price into the purchasing of the airplane. So going back to the story I told earlier, this one airplane that I was looking at, like I said, I think it had a lot of red flags. It's still an airplane of interest, but at the current price listing, it's not worth it for me to go after. If this price was to drop another $20,000 to $30,000, then it's something I may consider. And again, it's something I would consider going down the pathway of, but would also need a very robust look at the engine before making a final decision on purchasing. So last couple comments here as we close out this conversation on engine overhauls. The other thing to remind you is, as I mentioned at the beginning, as a private owner, the overhauls are really strong suggestions, and you should really base it on the aircraft utilization. For me and my airplane, what I try to do as a factor of the engine, a future overhaul, and just overall engine well-being, is I try to fly this airplane at least once, if not twice a week or more, depending on my work schedule, to make sure that the engine is getting exercise on a regular basis. And the reason for that is this engine was about 400 hours or maybe even more past the recommended TBO time, because it had always been operated pretty regularly and was operating quite well. And so my plan here again is with this airplane, this engine, is to continue to fly it multiple times a week to keep the engine exercised, lubricated, and operating well. I also tend to baby it a little bit, so I tend not to go full power for long periods of time. I try to keep it in that 75 to 80% power point, and do those things to try to preserve the longevity of it. The other thing is, once you get an engine back, probably the most critical thing that you need to do after the engine's installed and the operational check is done is ensure that you break it in properly. So you basically want to make sure that the cylinders and the gaskets and heads are all properly broken in. So in order to do that break-in, it's a couple things. Generally, you're going to want to operate that engine for a period of time at high power settings, and really try to minimize, low power flying until the engine's broken in. The shops who do your overhaul are going to give you their recommended break-in processes, as well as the engine manufacturer has break-in processes. Generally, like I said, for this airplane, what I did for the first about 45 hours was, basically minimize taxi time, took off as soon as possible, and tried to keep it at 85% or higher power output. So generally that was 24, 2500 RPMs, and just try to run it for a long period of time. And what you're trying to do is get all the elements of the engine to just properly seat and mature. And then signs that your engine is broken in well is you'll start to see kind of a leveling of engine operating temperatures, especially the exhaust gas temperatures. And so this is where you'll just work closely with your AMP on that. All right, folks, so that's a very high level of engine overhaul and the engine overhaul process, and primarily my experiences with it, as well as just some of the things I've researched along the way. If you've gone through an engine overhaul, or if there's anything that I missed, or anything that I maybe even said incorrectly, please comment below. I think, again, like all these things, it's really designed here to help provide, some thought-provoking ideas to folks, things to consider in your aircraft ownership experience, and or if you're in the process of considering purchasing an aircraft. And the goal here is to, hopefully help you out and have those as considerations when you're thinking about your airplane. Again, if you have any other thoughts, please let me know. I always appreciate you joining. And if you enjoy this video and want to see others, please like, subscribe, and recommend to others. And as always, I do look at all the comments that are provided here, so please provide your comments and we'll go from there.